What is going on, everyone? So this video I'm doing something a little bit different. We're kind of doing some engine CSI work. So what I have here is I have a single overhead cam Subaru 4-cylinder. It's a horizontally opposed boxer 4-cylinder. The story with this motor is that it came out of a Subaru Forester, and they were driving from New Mexico, and when they left New Mexico, the engine had oil in it. When it came here to Southern California, it had no oil in it. And apparently, as they were driving into the driveway for their destination, the motor locked up. And we have a visualization of why it locked up. So as you can see here, Uncle Rodney is trying to leave the engine case. So we have a severely damaged engine. Now, the Forester that this came out of, it got a junkyard motor put in it. It was a fairly decent used engine, and it went back to New Mexico with no issues. This engine though, however, we want to I'm curious to see what exactly it looks like inside, what exactly failed. This motor isn't particularly valuable in terms of Subaru motors. I know a lot of guys put these in Volkswagens and stuff like that, and it's a great engine for that because it's got plenty of power for that. But this motor particularly, this exact one, because we have a severely damaged case, we're probably going to have this cylinder's combustion chamber and cylinder head damaged as well. On top of any of the metal that was in here is probably cross-contaminated things. This motor is pretty much junk. So kind of doing this for fun. Want to see what everything looks like inside and how bad the damage actually is. And any usable parts we'll try to salvage. But this is a good example on if you buy a used motor. Now, if you buy a used motor and literally the case comes apart in your hand, it's probably not going to be a good purchase. However, there are a lot of engines on Craigslist, eBay, OfferUp, whatever website you want to go to that may or may not be good signs or good candidates. And there's a couple things that we'll look at in terms of tearing this down that you need to look for in purchasing a motor. The motor is fairly locked up. The crank does not want to turn, so we're probably going to have to be kind of creative with how we're going to get this all apart. Cylinder head should come off no problem. That should be pretty straightforward and easy, but actually getting the pistons out and splitting the case might be a little bit more medieval. Now with this engine, as I stated, it did have no engine oil in it, but what it does have is it has a glitter factory inside of the oil pan. So you can see there is a large amount of what once was engine guts that we could, fish out. This is how the car came. It had literally no engine oil in it whatsoever. If we use a magnet, a fair amount of it is ferrous. So we're looking at, components like bearings, crankshaft, connecting rod, stuff like that. And this is pretty finely ground contaminant. But seeing as the end of the connecting rod, or something at least, I don't know for sure, we're gonna tear it down, is hanging out the side there, I imagine the piston is probably part of this storm of glitter. Now, if it was just piston's aluminum, it's not magnetic, not ferrous, so it wouldn't stick to the end of my magnet. So we're looking at probably multiple types of failures at this point because of the ability that some of this is magnetic, although some of it does look pretty silver. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear into this motor, again saving what we can save. There's not really a ton that we can save. It's a non-variable valve timing engine, so there's not a ton. Actually, I take that back, it has got variable valve timing. However, it's probably not much that's savable. So I'm gonna run a time lapse, and yes, this is a GoPro mounted to a pole jack held on by a zip tie. I am not a professional. This is just for fun. So this is just going off of what I have, and I'll take you guys along for the ride. So I'll stop, periodically with the time lapse to talk about different stuff we find. But what we're probably gonna do now is I'm gonna pull off the valve covers, pull off the timing set. That way we can get to where we can get a cylinder head off and start to get dug into this blown up engine. So kind of one of the crazy things is I got the valve covers off just because I wanted to see if I could get the cylinder heads off without taking the valve train components, and it does look like I can. I've never delved into one of these single overhead cam super motors, so I'm kind of learning as I earn in this case, but the motor is actually free. I anticipated that the motor would be locked up, but the motor does turn over, which means we do have a kind of a high hope for getting this apart. Now, with an engine, if it is completely locked up, that can be really difficult to get out of a vehicle. If it's a manual transmission vehicle, not so much of a big deal. You can yank it off of the input shaft of the transmission, and you know it's not that big of an issue. You can unlock the motor on the engine stand, or in this case, the engine rebuild cart. But if it is an automatic equipped vehicle, getting the torque converter bolts can be quite difficult because typically, you know, you only have a small window. This is a window for this particular Subaru to get the torque converter bolts out. So sometimes you do got to be creative in loosening the crankshaft up. It's not ideal to take a blown out or a locked up motor out of a vehicle with the torque converter attached. The torque converter holds around, you know, 1 to 2 quarts of ATF in it, and that makes a giant mess on top of it. Can damage the input shaft of the automatic transmission or damage the torque converter. So there's good news that this is free spinning. That means we'll have a little bit of an easier time getting the case apart, and it was an easier time for whoever took this motor out of the vehicle. So we'll continue on taking the timing set off. I'll probably try to get it loosely on top dead center. It's not going to really matter. This motor is not savable, and I imagine there's going to be quite a bit of carnage in there. So we'll move forward. So I'm removing the timing setup and all of the associated parts that would impede removing the cylinder heads. I'm going to take the cylinder heads off as a unit. The EJ20s allow for the cylinder head with the cam and the valve train to come off as one. I'm going to use a breaker bar to break loose the 12-point head bolts as to not strip them out. Alright, so I got the head bolts out, and taking the head bolts out, I can already get the smell, and there's a distinct smell with blown up engines, and this motor definitely has it. This is the side of the cylinder that we have our issues with, so we'll pop this off and see what kind of damage we have inside. Hopefully it's not going to be too difficult to come off, and just a couple taps and we're good. So looking at the cylinder head side of it, it's actually not bad. I don't want to look cooling all over the ground, but not really too much damage. In fact, I can't really see anything. So this is potentially a decent cylinder head, as long as it doesn't have a blown head gasket. But let's take a look down inside, and we actually have the piston there too. Let me get a light turned on so that you can see it. So we have a fairly intact piston, which is kind of remarkable. So one of the things we can do real quick is I will put the camera down and see if that piston moves with the rod. So we're turning the motor over. Yeah, that piston ain't going anywhere. And if I go top dead center on this back cylinder, it locks up. So we're looking at the connecting rod has broken probably the bottom portion of the piston. The case is obviously damaged, but that is kind of nice that the cylinder head's not damaged. That means the cylinder head is salvageable. So we'll pop off the other side, and then we'll start to see if I can manipulate the engine to where I can get the cylinders in the right spot to get the wrist pins out so that I can crack the case and expose the crank and everything. That is probably going to be a pretty big fight. So we'll see how that goes. At this point now, both cylinder heads are off. I'm going to probably pop off the water tube there so it's not in the way, and then we'll work on taking out the plugs to gain access to the piston wrist pin retaining clips, and then that way we can work on trying to get the 3 of the pistons out. This 4th piston I don't think I have to worry about too much, to then split the case, take a look at what that connecting rod looks like. I'm removing the water pump to make it a little bit easier to get to the access port to remove the piston pin retaining clips, as well as removing the oil pump since I'm at that point, and I'm also going to remove the windage tray that's still in the bottom of the case. Those, along with the large crankshaft timing gear, get removed just to make it a little bit easier to split the case apart. From that point, I'm going to go through and remove the access plugs. There's 2 in the front and 2 in the back of the case on either the right and left side. This allows you to gain access again to those those piston retaining clips, which you use just to set a needle nose to get out relatively easily. At this point, I don't have the special tool to remove these properly. There's a special little slide hammer attachment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the front and rear ports and then use a long screwdriver and lightly tap on it to push the piston pins out. This requires the back 2 cylinders to be close to top dead center to be able to get the front 2, and then the back 2 I can go through the same ports, and it's fairly simple from there. Alright, so now I got the 3 connected to the connecting rod piston pins out. Not in the most conventional way. I don't have the proper tool to do so. Apologies for those of you that are kind of cringing at that. Have the motor up so that I can start to split the case. There's a couple bolts, a couple little 10s that need to come out, and I've removed everything else, so the case should split. I do have some first signs of some damage though. This that's wrapped around this coolant tube or oil tube looks to be part of the connecting rod. More than likely it's going to come out probably that way a little bit easier. And then I also have what looks like the rod cap end right there floating around. When I was messing around with pushing the piston pins out, I used a really long screwdriver and lightly tapped them out the opposite direction. I had to move that piston a little bit to gain access to the back piston, and it moved, and it actually curled the connecting rod out. So what it looks like so far is it looks like the connecting rod end failed. There's, you know, bits of the big end of the connecting rod sitting down there. So we'll get the case split, and that should reveal all of our damage then at this point. So I don't think there's anything impeding me, so we'll see how that goes. I'll take that little 10 off and then start cracking the case bolts apart, which shouldn't be too terribly difficult. So along with that small 10, there's a bunch of other different case bolts that are 12s and 14s. The 14s are going to be 12 point, and they're going to be in the coolant passages of the block. I'm using breaking them loose by hand first to not round them off, and then using an impact, little electric impact to get them completely out. I really don't want them to round off and make tearing this case really difficult. From there, the case is just held together with silicone, so it's pretty easy to just tap apart. There's a couple pry points on the case to remove everything, but it does take a little bit of time to go through and get all of the case bolts. There's some in the back and some in the front. Alright, so I got the case split and the crankshaft removed so that we can see some of the damage. With the crankshaft out, we can see, you know, we're obviously missing a connecting rod. It looks like the connecting rod big end failed. I got both ends right here, so you can actually see the stud still intact and bolted, but the end is gone. So those are the 2 tangs where the 2 bearing inserts would have lived. And here's the other side. Same thing, didn't survive very well. The crankshaft here, you can actually see where this has turned really dark. This is where it's gotten super hot. So imagine the oil galley plug, which you can sort of see right there, not really well because the light's not great, but it should look like that one. Plugged, or it didn't get oil to this connecting rod for some reason, and that overheated. The overheating or lack of lubrication caused metal on metal contact and caused everything to heat up. This crankshaft, although, you know, with the grooving on it, may be able to be reground. Because it's all overheated on this end, it's not savable whatsoever. There's a fair amount of damage here too, where the connecting rod spun around and hit it a couple times. The piston I left in the block for just a second. We can actually see how the connecting rod end was bashing the end of the case right there. And it is actually folded completely over, and we have our little access window right there to get in. So that's how that was. So the connecting rod actually bent and curved over a little bit. So let me push the piston out and we'll take a look at that end. All right, so with removing the piston from the bore, we can see the big end of the connecting rod is completely wadded up. It's bent over on itself, and you can also see the real dark marks where it's where it got hot. Now, unfortunately, you don't have the advantage that I do of you can actually smell it, and the smell of burning oil or severely burnt oil is pretty strong on this engine. We can see there's damage there from where the end of the connecting rod that broke off was hitting it. The piston itself, there's some scoring on the bottom of the cylinder wall, or sorry, the bottom of the cylinder skirt, and this would be the major surface that kind of drags on the bottom of the cylinder. Has some pretty good chunks taken out of it. The special coating that resides on these pistons from Subaru isn't there anymore. And we can tell that golden color right there, that's a lack of oil changes and kind of a lack of maintenance. Looking into the cylinder liner itself, it's got a fair amount of scars and scrapes. Now that big inspection hole that we have there, that's making to where this case half and the other case half are pretty much only good for garbage. But it was, you know, entertaining to take this apart and take a look and see what was inside. The case half is done, the crankshaft is done. The cylinder heads are remarkably okay, and in fact this Subaru motor didn't have any sign of blown head gaskets or anything like that. The coolant that's coming out of it is fresh, so it's kind of a bummer. Some of the stuff looks like it was maintained while others doesn't. The cylinder head's nice and clean up here, and it doesn't look like there's really any damage. The cam lobes aren't showing anything that's too terribly, you know, wrong. Same with the valves. The valves are fairly clean considering the mileage of the motor. However, the engine though, when I kind of gave a little bit more inspection to it, I haven't popped off one of the rods yet, but pulling and looking at the main bearings on this half of the case, there's, you know, a lot of grooving, a lot of pitting, which is, you know, an indication of a lack of oil. The piston too, I didn't notice the bottom of the skirt got nicked off after I set it down and I turned the camera off. So this motor's pretty much done. It's gonna go into our recycle bin and live another life as a refrigerator door or something along those lines. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch the video. This is one of those things that I find super fun and entertaining to see, you know, what went wrong and what catastrophic failure that the engine had. And it is, you know, kind of just a exploratory type deal. So I hope you guys found this entertaining. Again, I hope to see you in the next video, and thank you for watching.